I'm here today with Bonnie O'Neill. Bonnie has a son and two siblings with type 1 diabetes and is an active board member and strategic leader of the founding chapter of the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation, the world's leading funder of research to cure, prevent, and treat type 1 diabetes. As a member of JDRF's National Speakers Bureau, Bonnie is a featured presenter at educational conferences throughout the T1D community. She has contributed essays on raising a child with T1D to the heavily trafficked diabetes website Beyond Type 1, where her articles typically reach between 20 and 30,000 readers with high engagement. Bonnie's a spiritual director, the executive director of Alpha Mid-Atlantic, and lives in suburban Philadelphia. But the real reason why we're here today is because Bonnie is just coming out with a new book called Chronic Hope: Raising a Child with Chronic Illness with Grace, Courage, and Love. So Bonnie, it's really wonderful to have you here with us today.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks for that great introduction. It's wonderful to be here and to see you again.
Well, it sounds like you're doing phenomenal work, and I'm really happy to be a part of your book launch. As we're recording this, the book is going to be coming available tomorrow, which is wonderful. Yes. Congratulations.
Thank you. So I'm all on pins and needles. I'm going to try to contain them.
Well, I'm sure it's very exciting.
Yes.
But before we get into the book itself, maybe you could just give us an overview of your background.
Sure. So as Brian said, I live in suburban Philadelphia, and I actually grew up in suburban Philadelphia, but on the other side of the Delaware River in South Jersey. And then after college, went to New York City and lived there for a few years as a banker and met my husband. And then after he finished business school, we had the absolute joy of living in Paris for 3 years. And that's where I studied for and earned my master's in French literature and civilization. And boy, that was a great, so fun.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
I'll take 3 years in Paris anytime.
I know. We thought every day was going to be like that, honestly, oh, this is a great life. And I had our first child there in Paris, my first son. And then we moved to Miami a couple of years later, and then had 2 more children there, another son and daughter, and then moved to Connecticut and finally found ourselves here in the Philadelphia area. We also did 2 years in London, which was another amazing, phenomenal experience with 3 kids in tow, and that was great. So I sort of hung up the banking career once I started this moving around constantly and having a family. And then certainly once my middle son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, that kind of became a full-time job just because of the complexity of the disease and the multiple times a day, kind of interruptions from the school nurse about, his blood sugar is too high, it's too low, this is what he's eating, how much insulin should he have? And so it was such a complex disease to manage. And so that's when I really started just throwing myself full-time into my volunteer work with the JDRF, the Diabetes Foundation.
Wow. That's quite a background. I mean, an amazing set of experiences that you've had.
Yeah. As I said, when we were living in Paris, just 2 dumb kids, we thought life was always going to be easy and beautiful and no hiccups. And then you find that life is full of surprises, and the challenge is how do you meet those surprises head on?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is your second book. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what your first book was all about?
Yeah. So can I show and tell?
Certainly.
Okay, well, first I have to show this baby first. So this is Chronic Hope. This is the one coming out tomorrow, Raising a Child with Chronic Illness with Grace, Courage, and Love. My first book kind of happened accidentally. It's called My Identity is in Christ, Discovering the Freedom God Always Intended. I wrote that a few years ago. I was leading a Bible study, and we actually had been, I didn't come full circle in my story. I'm sorry. I stopped after London. I guess the thoughts of the Queen and everything just sort of got to my head, and I forgot to finish the story. I'm now working for Alpha Mid-Atlantic, where I help churches. It's a faith-based nonprofit, and I help churches run the Alpha course, which is basically an introduction to Christianity and a safe space to ask the difficult questions of life, like why am I here, and who is God? Is there a God? Who is Jesus? Why did he die? Those sorts of things. Well, way back when we were living in London, we actually were attending the church that founded the Alpha Course 30
Mhm.
years ago. And so that was my first introduction to it, actually. And so when we came home from London, I started an Alpha Course in my neighborhood with some of my neighbors. And we enjoyed it so much that we stayed together as a Bible study afterward. And so then eventually I was looking for something to offer to this group of women who didn't really have familiarity with the Bible. And I really couldn't find a study that I liked. And so I started writing one, and that morphed into this book. And
Mhm.
I didn't know that I was writing a book until at least, well, probably a year or more into it. And then I realized, oh, I think you have a book here. So now you need to make sure they've got like 10 chapters. You can't like land it on 9. That wouldn't make very much sense. And make sure that each section is the same amount of length and space and whatnot. So as I said, I sort of happened upon it accidentally. And then my church wanted to use it for a summer women's Bible study. And so I actually didn't have time to shop it around. And so I just self-published it, and not knowing anything about that was quite the interesting journey.
How did how did you self-publish it? Which platform did you use?
I did it through Amazon.
Okay.
And so it was, the trickiest part about that was starting with a Word document. And then once you upload it onto their system, I don't know, it might be better now, but then the formatting was really wonky. And so that I felt like I was pulling my hair out. But as I'm sure everyone who's listening to this interview knows, that you learn so much as a writer, things you never thought you were going to learn, and not just about the writing craft, but about all kinds of things related to technology and social media. So that was the hardest part about it, I think, was trying to sort out all of those formatting issues that if I had just started writing it on their platform, that's not an issue for you. At
Interesting.
least that's the way it was a few years ago.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
So what led you to write the new book?
Yeah, that's a good question. So as I said, I've been really involved with JDRF for a number of years, and I have been on their a member of their speakers bureau. So, I would get a call to go, and usually it was a research update that I would give, because I was intimately acquainted with what our research was. And then one time I got the email request to speak on the psychosocial impact of diabetes on the family. And I thought, well, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a psychologist. Like, what do I know, And as I thought about it and reflected on it, I realized that I have really had firsthand experience with this disease my whole life. My brother was diagnosed when he was 8 years old. And he didn't survive the diagnosis. They didn't recognize it in time, and it was a long time ago. And he died a couple of days later.
Wow.
And this was before I was born. And so my parents decided to have me really to replace the child that they had lost. And so I always grew up in this shadow of diabetes. And then my oldest sister was diagnosed 8 years after I was born with type 1. And so then my other sister and I, we were just, and my parents too, for us, we were just really afraid our whole childhood that we would get this same disease. And then when I guess I was about 25, I thought, well, phew, I'm too old now. I'm not going to get this disease. And, but then when I started having children, I started to get concerned for them. And so I remember my second pediatrician said, Bonnie, you'll recognize the signs if you see it. It's frequent urination, intense thirst, and you'll know what to do. And so anyway, when my son Austin was 5 years old, I recognized the signs in him and actually diagnosed him in our house and took him to the pediatrician and said, my son has type 1. And so because it was such a personal disease in my family, I just entered this awful spiritual crisis. I had followed God my whole life, and I completely turned my back on him for 2 years. And it was an experience. If anyone has ever been through that, that sort of thing where you wander away from God and say, I don't want any more to do with you. So often that place that you sit in, that sort of dark night where you can't find him, is the most important thing for your spiritual journey. And it was for mine. I sort of had to reconstruct my faith and to something that's more solid. God is not my genie in a bottle anymore. I have a very different relationship with him than I didn't even realize what I had before. But anyway, as I was sharing my story in this session at this education conference, my story and the impact of diabetes on my family, as I'm looking up in the audience, I see all of these people wiping their eyes, and like some people are really, really crying. And I realized I was hitting a nerve with people when I talked about my own anger, my crisis that I had. I didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but just that I was angry at the world. I was afraid constantly. I needed control, and all of this, I felt like life had just spiraled out of my control. And at the end of the Q&A session, one of the men in the audience said, "Well, when's your book coming out?" And I just laughed. I'm like, "Well, I'm not writing a book." And then when I left the seminar and was going to my car, a woman stopped me in the parking lot who had been in the session, and she said, "Well, are you a therapist? Because I would pay to see you." And I'm like, "No, I don't even live around here. I live down near Philadelphia." But those things, they stirred, they worked within me. And when I got to the place where I wanted to write something again, I knew that was what I needed to write about, because it's what I know better than anything else. And I've been on this journey of hope, going from complete despair to living a much more hopeful life. And I also realized, as one does when one's putting together a book proposal, there was really nothing out there, no other resource, no other books out there that were like this. There were some that were overtly Christian, which is great. And in fact, I had started mine out to be a more spiritual book. But there was nothing for people for whom a book like that would just not be what they would want to pick up, And there were a lot of books out there for parents raising a child with a specific disease, with the how-tos of that particular disease, but nothing that just was dealing with the emotional stress of raising a child with a complex condition that just blindsided you. So that's how I started to write the book.
Well, good for you for listening to the people that you talk to and to God and to, pulling that together.
Yeah.
So the book isn't a typical linear type of book. You describe it more as a spiral.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That's kind of a fun thing to talk about. I think when I started off the book, I was thinking, well, of course, I need to write chronologically. How do I do that? But I kept going back to these, the talks that I was then giving on the psychosocial impact of diabetes on the family. And they weren't written. I didn't deliver those talks chronologically. I started deep within my heart as the caregiver. And then I moved to the relationship with my son, and then the broader relationships with the family, and then going from the family home out into the wider world. And I realized what I had created was this spiral. And so as I sort of thought about that spiral, I realized that, in order to have a healthy family, we have to start with healthy parents. And so very often we don't even know what's going on in there. We have to stop and just take a look around and attend to what's going on in there. And so this spiral is really beginning with deep in the heart of the caregiver, and then moving out to the relationship with that child, and then the couple relationship. Oh my, does that take a beating? And then the sibling relationships. And then from there, we can move out into the wider world. And then one of the things that I realized on this spirally journey is that the things that we think that we've conquered earlier on in the journey, like anger or fear or bitterness or control, we revisit them later on the journey. And it surprises us because we think, well, I thought I had just gotten rid of, fear. I thought I had conquered my need for control and I can't control this disease or this child. But you revisit it farther out on your journey of hope. And so it looks different. And so that's another spiral. And then after I finished the book, I really discovered a third spiral that was in there that was informed by my practice as a spiritual director. And one of the things we'll say in spiritual direction is the way out of the cave is going deeper in. And so if you want healing, you can't just, keep trying to go out there and look for healing. You have to go way down deep within and notice what's there and then attend to it. And from that place, you can find your way out. And so, yeah, I think there's all of those three spirals are in the story in Chronic Hope.
Wow, that's just very interesting. I really hope that a lot of people who have nothing to do with diabetes find this book.
Yeah, I do too. And, it's when I wrote the book, obviously the story, so it's written in, every chapter is in narrative and reflection. And so there's a part where I talk about the particular story that's going on, and then I reflect on it, as I'm stepping out of that scene and I'm reflecting on it later. But all of the reflection piece, obviously the narrative piece is about my experience with a son with type 1 diabetes, but the reflections were all intentionally written to be looser than that and more expansive than that for anyone with any sort of chronic condition. And then the interesting thing with the book launch team, as a part of that, I did a book club and created a discussion guide to go along with that. And in that group, probably a third of the people that were in those Zoom calls had a child with a chronic illness, in this case, type 1 diabetes, and the others didn't. And in some cases, they weren't even talking about a child, but every single person was able to relate to the fact that we live our lives really trying to hold on to control. And I started joking with these people in this group that I should have named the book Chronic Control, because we just don't want to let go of control, do we? And when life deals us something that we just weren't anticipating and is not to our liking. And so everybody could relate to that. Everybody can relate to, especially in these COVID days, like fear. What do I do with this fear? How do I move beyond fear and live out of a place of grace, courage, and love? So yeah, I've found that the book is much more accessible than even my wildest expectations. I mean, when I wrote it, you're always encouraged to write to that one person, like if it's a target you're looking at, you have your one bullseye avatar, and then you have those concentric circles around it. And so for me, those concentric circles were a parent of someone with any chronic illness, and then going out, any parent who just needs a little bit of hope. And then farther than that is anyone who needs a little hope and wants to practice letting go of control and fear and anger and everything else that mucks us up and keeps us from living free.
So I have to ask, you attended one of the Frederick Buechner Writers Workshops that I helped produce 3 years ago.
Yeah.
And so can you talk about just kind of how that experience and some of the people you met there impacted your writing in the book?
Yeah, I would love to. I have two other show and tell things that I could pull out, but I don't have to. So in one of the sessions, Robert Benson was there, and he was talking about how he would put on his French beret when he was, his creative writing phase and just getting the words out there. And then when it was time to edit, he would put on his Yankees cap, because Yankee Man had to undo everything that Beret Man had said that, needed to go on the cutting floor. And then he would put on his fedora when it was time to, find a publisher and do all the promotional work. And that was his businessman side. And so a little while later, it was probably a year later, I was I was stuck a little bit with the voice because I would, in this narrative part, I would tell about an experience where I was sad or I was angry or I was looking for control. And maybe my son was 5 years old or he was 10 years old. But then I wanted in the reflection piece, I needed to step out of that, what I was started to dub sad Bonnie, and I needed to be wise Bonnie and say something else. And I needed to let the reader know I couldn't keep flipping back and forth at the same time. I needed these two different voices. And so the Robert Benson's example came back to me. And so I thought, I wonder if I have maybe not hats, but something else that I could use to help me remember which voice, which Bonnie I am as I'm writing. And so I grabbed my son's baby blanket that I still had and a JDRF scarf that I had. And I had them on my writing table right next to me. And when I was sad Bonnie, who was trying to remember back maybe 10 years before or 15 years before to something that had happened and to try to evoke those emotions and stay in that voice, I wore Austin's baby blanket. And then when it was time to give wisdom, I would just put that aside and I wrapped the scarf around me, and I think it worked. So if you're
Wow.
talking to Robert Benson, give him thanks for me.
That is great. I mean, I love that analogy that he used, and he wrote about that in one of his books.
Yeah,
And,
he did.
so it's really wonderful to see how you adapted
Yeah.
and applied it.
It was so practical because I was working with a writing coach, and, as I said, we've lived in a lot of different places, and she was just saying, I can't track with your story. I don't know where you are and you're not telling it linearly. And so I'm not sure how old Austin is and why are you were just busted up over something that happened, and then you're giving a little bit of wisdom and like we got to sort this out. And so that was so helpful. And then the other thing that was amazing was I had a one-on-one with Marilyn McIntyre,
Yes.
and who ultimately ended up writing an endorsement for me
Yes.
on a cope, which was so generous of her. And so when I was sharing with her about the spiral nature of the book, so she is an author and she was a professor at UC Berkeley in the medical humanities. And so a lot of her work has been also dealing with caregivers, more at kind of end of life caregiving. So maybe with adult children who are caring for their parents, or even the medical team caring for people at that stage. And so she had a lot of experience with that. And the idea of the spiral really resonated with her. And she encouraged me to press into that and just to play with, and that was the word she used, to play with the round and roundness of bumping into those issues that you thought you had conquered earlier on in your journey, but there they are again in a new form. And so that was really encouraging to me, just to have her voice, who has so much more experience than I do, both in terms of her knowledge with the medical humanities, but also just as a writer and understanding the structure of a book, to just say, yeah, play with that. That's important.
I can really see her loving your book.
Yeah, yeah. So when next time you talk to Marilyn, thank her again.
Yes, absolutely. We'll do. So we talked earlier about your first book being self-published, and your second book is from Morgan James.
Yeah.
So talk, if you could, a little bit about how that book deal happened.
Yeah. So that's another God thing. So I think we were, I think this was about April of 2019. Yeah, COVID time kind of like mixes everything up. I think it was April of 2019. And I had kind of put the book aside. I was exploring going to seminary, and also studying to become a spiritual director. And those things were both slated to start in September. Oh, no, actually, I'm sorry. Seminary was going to start in June. And I had written the book proposal, hadn't really queried it out. I think I just chickened out. And I had probably 7 sample chapters done. It's a book of really 29 chapters if you include the introduction and the postlude. So it's short chapters. So I was sort of awakened, I guess, with kind of a dream in very early April with very clear detail. Bonnie, if you got up every morning and wrote for a couple of hours every day, you would have the book finished by April. By August, the end of August, defer seminary and start in the fall. And it was vivid. It was very,
Wow.
very clear. And first of all, I'm thinking, okay, but this doesn't make sense because I don't have a publisher. So why would I finish writing this? But anyway, in my stupor of being half asleep, half awake, I tried to do the math on it. And I'm like, okay, so 29 chapters minus 7 equals 39. No. 27. I couldn't even do a simple math thing. And then like there's 4 months between April and the end. How many weeks? And I kept trying to work it out. Couldn't work it out. And the next morning I woke up, did the math easily since I was wide awake. And it's very simple math. And sure enough, it was going to take me 4 months. I would have it all wrapped up. And then I would have August to catch my breath before seminary would start. And so then I just sort of like put it out to the Lord. I said, but that doesn't make any sense. Like you don't finish a nonfiction book without a publisher. So why would I do that? And again, just taking a walk, taking a jog, something in the next few days, there was this really strong sense, let the publishing take care of itself. So I don't advocate this for everybody, but that's literally what I heard. And so it's, yes, sir. So I sat down starting that next day, and every morning, Monday through Friday, I wrote probably 3 hours a day. I just wrote till I was done, and because I had to knock out a chapter a week. And that would get it like mostly in good form. And then I could have a couple more weeks to play with kind of editing the whole thing. I started seminary. I started spiritual direction training. Then I got my job offer to start with Alpha in October. By this point, I was querying for agents. And then I began to understand. I'm starting this job in January. The book needed to be finished. I had to have it finished before I found a publisher, even though it still doesn't make any sense, because with a new full-time job and doing spiritual direction training, the seminary had to go by the wayside. I would not be able to finish that. And so then a couple weeks after I said yes to the Alpha offer, I was at actually an Alpha conference, a regional conference, and I saw a friend of mine that I hadn't been in contact with in a while. And just the Lord was specifically pointed her out to me. And I just went over to her, she came up to me, we chatted. I said, hey, why don't we have coffee? We had coffee. And then she ended up offering, I didn't solicit it. She offered, would you like me to put you in touch with my publisher, Morgan James? And I said, sure, that would be great. That was the beginning of November. We made some contact. I guess that was more like the end of November. Anyway, in the beginning of January, just freshly started with my new job was when we signed the deal with Morgan James. So it was, in my case, it was strange, I guess, not the usual.
Very non-standard, but I mean, that's every story about getting a book published is so unique.
Yeah.
And a lot of, non-standard ways.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I was doing that due diligence. I did have my writer's market book. It's over there on the bookshelf. I was like going through, making my Excel spreadsheets of everyone I needed to contact. I was reaching out to agents, heard back from a couple, keep us posted, but then when this happened, I understood why I needed to write the book. And I think there was a piece once I woke up that night in April and with this word, write the book, there was a little piece, because I had a sense that it was in someone else's hands, not just mine.
Wow. How wonderful.
Yeah.
How cool that, the
Yeah.
way that played out.
Yeah.
That's just really neat.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that story too. I mean, that's a great story.
It's a fun one. Thanks for letting me share it. Yeah.
So just to finish up, what are, kind of your greatest hopes for people to take away from the book?
Yeah. I just hope that wherever people are on their journey today, that they'll know that hope can always be found. So days might seem dark, especially now in these COVID days we're living in, but there's always hope. It's what seems like a dead end is not a dead end. There's always more hope to be found. I hope that people will read the book, and through the honesty, because I'm raw in this book. There are places right before I sent it to the publisher, I thought, you really want this to go out there, kid? Because you don't look too good in some of these chapters. But I want people to know that they have the permission to feel what they feel, because there's nothing wrong with our feelings. There's nothing to judgy in our feelings. Feelings are meant for us to notice so that we can attend to them and find healing from them. And if you are someone who takes things to God, it is wonderful to know what you're feeling, because there's a very safe space to take it. So yeah, naming our emotions, attending to them is really, really important. And I learned in writing this that raising a child with a complex condition has not only made me a better parent, it's made me a better person. It's made me slow down and be kind to myself, be kind to others. So I think that's grace. I think that's offering each other and ourselves grace. And I've had to learn a lot of courage. I've had to grow in courage. And so I hope that for my readers as well, and that they would just, experience more grace, more freedom, more courage, and more hope as they go through the book.
Wonderful. Well, I think it will. I really feel strongly about that, and appreciate so much you doing the work to complete it, to listening, to make it happen, and for sharing all that with us today.
Thank you. Yeah, I also I've written a 30-day hope journal that's going to go up on my website probably next week. I had it first reserved just for our launch team, but it's going to go up on the website because New Chronic Hope is my story, but it's an invitation for readers to write their story and just to go deep and to think about where is it that they need to just attend to certain things.
Well, when you have that ready, please send me a link to it, and I
will. Okay.
Along with the link for this interview.
Great.
Well, Bonnie, thanks again. Please stay in touch. Let us know, where your journey continues down the road.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It was great to be with you today, Brian.
Thank you.